Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Onboarding Subgrantees and Subrecipients webinar. My name is Rose Armour, and I'm the Training Manager for the Social Innovation Fund. This webinar was developed for grantees working with subgrantees and subrecipients, as the title says. And before we get started, I'd like to cover some basic housekeeping. First, your phones have been muted to reduce background noise during the presentation. There will be time for Q&A throughout the webinar, so to ask a question, use the chat panel to the right of your slides, sending your message to all participants. If you don't see the chat panel, you can click the speech bubble icon in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, as illustrated on this slide. A recording of today's presentation will be posted on the Knowledge Network in a little under a week, and we will also include the slide deck with that. So please share that with anyone in your organization that was not able to join the call today. So next slide. Today, we are joined by Brad Ward, who is a former SIF grantee and one of our compliance coaches. Ginny Callens, the Director of BIB to Backpack Program at the United Way for Southeastern Michigan. We have Amber, is a grant program and compliance advisor for AARP Foundation, and we have Kimberly, one of the SIF program officers. So thank you to all the presenters and to all the participants for joining us. And now I'll turn it over to Brad, who will start the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. You started by hearing our speakers and presenters. I'll start with my part of the presentation today by covering what we are calling a subrecipient or subgrantee. The Office of Management and Budget uses the term subrecipient to identify any entities receiving cash through a pass-through entity. So if you are giving a cash award, you have subrecipients or subgrantees. And in this webinar, we designed this for all SIF Classic grantees and for the Pay for Success grantees that provide cash to their subrecipients. We'll be using the term subs from this point on in the presentation, so when you hear that, please be aware of it. If you are not making cash awards, you have service recipients or technical assistance recipients. Definition out of the way. Thank you for indulging us. What we'll talk about today are the things that you should consider in advance of your subrecipient training or onboarding, what the training agenda should include, and how you'll carry all of these things into your ongoing relationship with your subs. Next slide, please. So we'll start with a recap briefly of what we covered in last week's webinar on risk management. The first thing that we asked you to do is take a look at what your subgrantees, what your subs experience is in managing federal awards, what their policies and practices are, their staffing, and their current budget requests to you. You likely grouped them into groups based on risk, high, medium, and low. And today we talk about what we are to do with that information from here and how you'll use that information to manage risk in the future. Next slide. Thank you. We'll start with a look at policies and procedures. Many times we focus on the financial policies and procedures, and they are all important, but it's also important to look at other areas where you will monitor your subs in the future. In their financial procedures, pay particular attention to procurement policies and confirm that they conform with the OMB Uniform Guidance, sections 200.318 to 326. You'll also have an opportunity to evaluate how consistently your subs follow their policies and procedures regarding budgeting and reporting each time you review their financial reports. So this is something you can use as an ongoing measure. In terms of personnel or HR, this is where you'll likely find information about their policies and procedures for managing criminal history checks and their processes for time and effort reporting. Here again, each financial report will give you some opportunity to evaluate how consistently they follow their processes and how thoroughly they document it. Something to call to your attention here, travel is an area of significant risk. So if you're paying any of your subs for travel or they request reimbursement for mileage, be sure you review carefully their policies and procedures on travel and travel reimbursement. Another area that's important to review is governance and compliance, specifically the organization's conflict of interest policies and procedures. It's a requirement that is put down by the Internal Revenue Service for all organizations that are exempt from federal taxation. And you'll want to confirm which staff members, in addition to the board, are required to comply with this policy. I'd also recommend that you review at least a sampling of their documentation at the first site visit and any site visits after that you feel are important. Next slide, please. Systems. This is the next area that will have an impact, where your policies and procedures will have an impact. You will have likely already identified some areas that need some additional support, but keep in mind that we're not asking them to recreate the wheel. Look first at what policies exist so that your subs can focus their energy on the areas that need the most attention. One of the things that Jenny Callens and I have long talked about is this idea of a three-part compliance checkup. And the idea here is to look at, when you're looking at any element of compliance, you want to look for three things. Is it consistent? Is it transparent? And is it documented? So in your internal systems, let's take, for example, adequate internal controls or payroll. Payroll is a better one. We're going to look to see that there is evidence that payroll is properly supported and approved. And we'll look at that throughout in an audit particularly, but we might look at that as a one-time basis thing initially to see what recommendations we might want to make to those subs along the way. Moving into other areas, what evidence do you have that staff are adequately trained? And what does their training plan look like? For criminal history check, this is a big area that we all focus a lot of attention on. What are the sources that your sub is using to conduct criminal history checks? Another area that you might want to look at is what is the plan for the sub to distribute information internally and to all departments or functions within their organizations? And an example from the field. One of my grantees came to me when they first came on board to let me know that they were working diligently to get all their policies and procedures put together. And I knew that they were part of a larger organization, so when I asked about it, there was a little bit of surprise that they could take existing policies and procedures and update those or modify them for use either by their department or by the organization as a whole for this federal award. So look for the shortcuts, not shortcuts, look for the ways that you can maximize the use of your time where you can. Next slide, please. Staffing. This one goes hand in hand with internal systems. Whether your subs are using existing staff or they hire new folks for their SIF program, it's important for you to do what you can to set them up for success. If your subs hire new staff, help them with an assessment to determine what support they need from you, how they're going to be learning about their new organization, and what their experience is in managing federal awards. It's also a great time to point out that the things they'll need to inform their program are right at their fingertips. The terms and conditions of the SIF grant, which we'll talk about later, their proposal, the notice of funding availability, and the authorizing legislations and regulations that underpin the SIF. It's critical that the staff charged with oversight of the subs, the grantees, are really familiar with all these regulations and can point people to the right places for answers. And the last thing to remember is you're not doing this work alone. Your program officer is there to support your program, and they can help point you to examples in the SIF Knowledge Network and other resources that will help you and your subrecipients. Next slide, please. Here's the next check of our three-part compliance checkup. The Subrecipient Agreement is the place to consolidate all of the information for your subs. This is a contract, and it will inform, you'll use it throughout your relationship with your subs, and it will inform how you monitor and what kinds of things you'll be looking at. So I recommend that you spend some considerable time on this element before you bring your folks together and before they sign, and cover the high points in your orientation or onboarding training. So let's look at a way we can look at the Subrecipient Agreement for the three-part checkup. For consistent, do you have a single document that is the template for all your subrecipients, and does it spell out all the expectations and requirements and deadlines? Is it transparent? Have you attached to the SIF terms and conditions, or have you made those available to your subs? and what kind of program and financial reporting format will you use, and have you made the content available and disclosed the due dates? And the last thing, is it documented? Is it signed by both parties? And if you're using electronic signatures, have you confirmed that your platform meets CNCS requirements for electronic signatures? Of note here, be sure you're clear about what kind of match is required with your program and what consequences there are if the sub does not meet the match requirement. We'll talk about match a little bit later in the presentation, but this is the first place I'd like to mention it. Next slide, please. So in terms of covering subrecipient expectations, they'll know by now that they're going to be monitored on this program, but they may not know all of the details. So if your subrecipient agreement includes some language about how you will monitor them, here's where you can talk about the framework and the elements of your plan, how you'll conduct the subrecipient monitoring, and what you'll do with that information. Match here is critical because you'll be looking at it all year long and all the lifelong that your subs receive funding through you. Another place to keep in mind that match is important to keep an eye on all year long. To maximize the efficient use of your resources, your risk-based approach helps you understand which subs are in the most need. And many SIF grantees use this to aggregate their information and look at how that might inform their initial technical assistance plan and what things they might want to offer in the future. So that's an area that you can keep in mind as well. The last thing is subrecipient expectations for key dates. They need to know when program reports are due, when financial reports are due, and what the consequences are to late submission of those things. The other thing that's important for them to know is to get meetings on their calendar so they can be present to you with 100% of their efforts. Next slide. Amber, Jenny, Kimberly, you all have anything to add here?
This is Amber from AARP Foundation. I'll go ahead and jump in for a few minutes, and then Jenny can maybe follow me after that. So a lot of what Brad just shared through the previous slides is really important information that I would echo. With the luxury of hindsight, I think myself and other colleagues at AARP Foundation have realized that the steps as an intermediary takes at the beginning of a SIF grant, sort of in identifying and selecting subs and assessing subs' risk and training needs, can really be critical to the overall long-term success of the SIF grant. One of the things that AARP Foundation has done to help finalize the selection and assessment of subs is to conduct pre-award site visits. So typically a team composed of a staff person from our grants team, our evaluation team, and programmatic team will travel to the potential sub-sites and spend at least a day getting a true sense of that organization. This pre-award site visit allows us to poke around at the potential subsystems, policies, staffing, and existing partnerships. And unless you have a sub that has received CNCS funds for a number of years, I'd be willing to bet that your subs will have some missing policy, procedure, or hole in their systems that will need to be addressed to be SIF compliant. The pre-award site visit also provides one of the few opportunities where we have the ability to connect with the majority of staff who will have a hand in the SIF grant. Specifically, this is an opportunity to speak with finance and operations staff, people who are going to provide the ledgers and reporting, people who are going to do the background checks, and otherwise individuals you might not regularly be in contact with as the programmatic piece of the grant goes on. Reflecting a little bit on our visits and thinking in terms of lessons learned, one of the things that we should really consider if we were to get another SIF grant and onboard some new folks would be to create a checklist of sorts that lists each of the systems, policies, and procedures that we would assess during those pre-award site visits. Really, that would serve two purposes. First, because the schedules and timing and the travel involved that happens in this sort of compacted time period when you're trying to award grants to your subs, we didn't always send the same team of people on all of the pre-award site visits. So the checklist would help to standardize the information that would be gleaned from those visits. And then secondly, the checklist information would help to identify technical assistance needs across subs that could be addressed at an onboarding convening. And then regarding the sub-agreement, AARP Foundation does utilize a template agreement for the subs. We attempt to share the template as early on in the process as possible, recognizing that organizations might have a number of eyes that need to see it and review it before it is signed and executed. For us, the agreement outlines things including funding, payment, and match, required systems, policies, and procedures, reporting and record keeping, monitoring, references to all the grant-related laws, regulations, and policies, and then when we finalize with subs, their budget and scope of work from their application is included. Again, thinking in terms of the benefit of hindsight, if we were onboarding a new cohort of subs, we would seriously consider actually hosting a webinar or a recorded webinar that we would walk through the key points of the sub-agreement. It seems that the person who is responsible for signing off and executing the agreement from the sub is aware of what's in the agreement, but I often do wonder if the staff who have a role in terms of implementation of the program have sort of the same awareness and understanding of the details, and that's where a webinar might be helpful to address that. I'll go ahead and let Jenny chime in with her perspective.
Hi, thanks, Am. That was great. I think I echo a lot of what you said, and I just want to add a couple of points. Clearly, process is really important at every stage of the SIF. So, as has already been noted, you know, the sooner you can start to establish processes and expectations, the better, with the understanding that you'll modify them as needed as you go along. And that brings me to a point I think is really critical, and that is a lot of the SIF can feel punitive. It can feel burdensome. It can feel overwhelming for the intermediary staff and for the subgrantee staff. So I think it's really important to instead use language that promotes the SIF as an opportunity for all of the organizations involved, again, at the intermediary and sub levels. All of those organizations now have an opportunity to get policies and procedures in place, to tighten up their standards, to just do a really, really good job with the SIF's help of being stronger organizations. So for us, when we joined SIF in 2011, there were policies and procedures we needed subs to have that we didn't ourselves have at United Way. So this was an opportunity for us to get our own house in order while also helping our sub-organizations to be better. So just try to, you know, use positive language. I think it's actually really important to be optimistic about SIF as a capacity building and organizational development opportunity. And then the last point I want to make at this juncture is to note that this requires many layers of organizational staff to communicate effectively with each other. Again, this is at the intermediary level and the subgrantee level. You've got to have people in the C-suite who understand what's going on. You've got the implementation staff or kind of the field staff or ground staff, and you've got all those layers in between. It is very important to set a tone and an expectation for how communication should be handled and make sure that everybody who needs to understand what's going on is, you know, is informed. You know, at your own intermediate organization and at the sub level. So just be really, really clear about, you know, even at you know, when you're in the onboarding process, make sure the right people are at the right meetings. Ask if you have the decision maker when you're going through financial policies, because if you're going through financial policies and expectations and you don't have the key financial decision maker, then you're going to have that conversation all over again. So think in advance about all the layers you've got to get through and plan accordingly.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Yeah, this is Kimberly. So I guess the one kind of larger piece of advice I have from the program officer perspective is that grantees who are the most successful put in a lot of time and effort during the first year to get the right policies, procedures, staff structure, et cetera, in place. And I'm not going to lie, the first year is tough. It's a big lift. but it helps to really lay that strong foundation for the next 5 years of the SIF. And it's much harder to go back later and course correct versus investing a lot up front. But like Jenny said, it will be necessary throughout the process to make those course corrections. So understand that going into it as well. But building that strong foundation during the first year allows you to let the SIF project proceed and focus more of the time later on the programmatic side of the work instead of getting stuck in a lot of the compliance throughout, you know, the longer term of the project.
Great, thank you, all three of you. Next slide, please. So looking at the actual agenda for your subrecipient training or orientation or onboarding, whatever you call it, comprehensiveness is the key to making this a successful event. Think in advance about what information you want to share about the Social Innovation Fund itself, your program, and what evaluation elements you're going to focus on during this opening training. As we've already discussed, be sure you include information about the cooperative agreement requirements and any of the compliance compliance recommendations you have to your subs as a whole in helping them be compliant with the requirements. I like to frame it as in this way. You're in a position to be both the captain of the ship and the cruise director. So you want to get your subs actively engaged during the orientation or onboarding. Treat them like you would a customer coming in to you for a service. Be friendly, supportive, and responsive. Your subs will work together for the duration of their SIF funding, so it's important to help them build a community where communications are clear and open. It's also important to include other critical staff at the orientation, such as fiscal staff, but to understand how they're going to involve the staff across the departments within their organizations once they leave the orientation. This is also a great time for you to listen to clues about what kinds of training you'll need or want to provide in the future. You can offer a variety of methods and topics that are related to the SIF or your program's goals. So be creative here. Think creatively about this. Be prepared to talk about how you'll communicate reminders, new developments, and other important information about your program during your orientation. And lastly, be sure to create electronic or paper materials that your subs can share within their organizations and with their partners. Help them communicate the expectations across the board. Next slide, please. We're going to drill down here to some of the critical elements that will be part of your subrecipient monitoring as you move forward. The budget is the blueprint, so use this in reviewing every part of the financial performance of your subrecipients. Be sure you have looked at the budget and budget narrative to be sure that the program activities they propose support the goals and objectives of the program, that they're outlined in the proposal and they're allowable, that the activities are not funded in another budget, and that you have a sufficient understanding from the budget narrative to determine the allowability of the cost and monitor their expenses along the way. If there's a need to make any revisions to the budget, either make that a requirement before they sign off on their subrecipient agreement, or make it a condition of award with a timeline and a deadline for them to meet those qualifications. And lastly, remember that this should be budget and revenue. So you'll be expenses and revenue. You'll be looking at match all year long, so you want to see that on their budget somewhere. I threw in a couple of things that you may not think about up front, but it's a good idea to now, and that is you should be ready to make available to them and clear what your method is to distinguish the federal and grantee shares of the match. And lastly, keep an eye on that match revenue all year long. It's important to monitor before your subs get into trouble and before they could do anything that would disqualify them from a future award. Next slide, please. Criminal history checks. This is the one that is the most troublesome and complicated for a lot of grantees and subgrantees to grasp. So spend your time here effectively explaining what resources are available to your subs. Be sure that you make clear to them that they are required to attend the National Service Criminal History Check training and how you'll confirm that it's been completed. Look at their procedures and what kind of documentation they plan to keep or they are keeping. How will they retain this information? Will it be electronic? Will it be paper? And remember that some of these items can only be collected at that moment they are conducting the criminal history check, such as the sex offender public website review. Be sure that they have a process to capture and document their reviews during this, as they're conducting criminal history checks. There's a link to the criminal history check resources page. Something that I'll point out to you that became my best friend while I was working at AIDS United is the National Service Criminal History Check Frequently Asked Questions. It's updated regularly with information, and CNCS does a great job of keeping this information relevant and updated for you so that you can use it at your disposal. Be sure you know how to find it, and be sure your subrecipients know how to find it as well. It will be really, really helpful to you moving forward. Next slide, please. Program reporting is the next area that you want to make easy on your subrecipients and on you. If you create a form and some expectations of your program reports that allow you to collect information regularly and put it into a template that you use for your program reports, you will have a really strong, cohesive program report if you're collecting the same kind of information from each of your subrecipients. Develop instructions so that your subs have a clear understanding of what information they're required to provide and when it's due, and what information progress reports should include, what documentation, if any, you will collect, and what the expectations are of your subs in moving forward. How do you want to help them tell their story about anecdotal findings in their program? They'll want to share that information, and if you ask for it throughout the year, you will have a trove of stories that you can use anytime to talk about the programs that your subrecipients are promoting in their communities. Develop a systematic way to collect it and share it, and you will have stories your life long. Lastly, program reporting compliance is another area that you may want to include in your review of your subrecipients for continued funding. If you have subs who are continually late or continually provide information that's not sufficient for your needs and to represent what their program is doing, you may want to address that as you make renewed funding for years 2 through 5 in SIF Classic. And if you are renewing with any of your subs for Pay for Success, you may want to take that into consideration as you move forward as well. Next slide, please. Reimbursement is the next area. This should be outlined in your subgrant or subaward agreement and in your orientation materials. You should be clear. You should have your policy put into what kind a policy that states what kind of account type you expect to see on reports. The size and capacity of your subgrantees may determine some of those elements, but take a look at that very carefully. Make sure that you use your reimbursement tool as a process for reviewing compliance. At any time that you collect a financial report from your subrecipients, you can take a look at what they are providing you, assess how well they are staying within budget, and what kinds of things you need to look for in the future. This is part and parcel of a strong compliance program. Be clear and comprehensive about what the impact of negative cash flow is. Be clear and explicit about what your timing is for repaying subs. Create an internal review process that you can use internally. Coordinate within your organization. Have cross conversations between departments so you know what's going on with your subs at any time. Lastly, determine whether you'll use electronic payment, if that's feasible for you, and what documentation you will need to keep in place to ensure that you are compliant and that your subs are receiving their payments on time. Lastly, there's a link to the Knowledge Network here where there are great samples that you might want to check out. Again, you're not reinventing the wheel. You're simply improving the wheel for your own use. The next slide, please. Financial performance. This is a really, really important part of your program. I encourage you to establish a process for financial reporting that can be an element of reimbursement or conducted separately. And here's another way you can check it against our three-part check: the consistent, transparent, and documented. So in terms of being consistent, use the process you designed for the level of risk that you assigned. Transparent, make information available to your subrecipients so that they know what they're being monitored on and can be responsive. And last, documented. If it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So those are the three things to keep in mind in terms of financial performance. Generally accepted accounting principles and OMB guidance say that financial systems should be able to produce accurate and timely reports on short notice. These reports will also allow you to assess whether the accounting information is on target, whether their financial systems are able to track and analyze the information as you need to, and you'll be able to tell how quickly they can produce a report. Another area to keep in mind here in terms of financial performance is match. So SIF Classic, dollar for what you give them at the subrecipient level. PFS 2014, subrecipient match is optional and is up to you to determine, but be sure you clearly inform your subs of the requirement and what, if any, of their match can be in kind. And Pay for Success 2016, your subs must match 100% of their cash award, but you must declare what portion, if any, of in-kind is allowable. Again, this is consistent, transparent, documented. Make sure you make this information available to your subs. If you're not in the habit of collecting a general ledger, this is the gold standard for financial review. Again, this is a reasonable assurance that their financial systems are adequate for managing their federal award, and it's an expectation that in the event of any audit or other financial review, they can produce a report like that on time. Consider what requirements you'll have in tracking revenues and expenditures, and what subrecipient categories you will monitor more closely throughout the year. Know where you're going to find that information on their general ledger and be familiar with it so you can conduct a thorough and efficient review as well. Next slide, yes. The last area we'll focus on is documentation and record retention. In case you didn't hear it enough, the three most important words in compliance are document, document, document. The second most important three words are retain, retain, retain. Documentation is your key to defending against questioned or disallowed costs during a site visit or audit. In relating some of this information to your subs, find a way to frame it as a benefit to them. Be prepared to talk about how this will benefit all of their programs and not just the SIF. I sometimes called myself the friendly auditor when I went to do site visits, and I reminded the subrecipients at AG United that I was on their team and I was there to strengthen their defenses. Being perceived as a friendly auditor is really important to developing a good relationship with your subrecipients. OMB standards of allowable, allocable, and necessary are key to determining what documentation to retain. Be sure their updated policies reflect what the staff are to collect and retain and how they're going to retain it. And again, as a reminder, many pieces of documentation can only be collected at a certain point in time, so be sure that you and they both have reasonable procedures to allow you to collect that. And lastly, a quick check of our three-part compliance checkup. In terms of consistent, what applies to you also applies to your subs by virtue of the SIF terms and conditions. Transparent, repeat this information as loudly and often as you can, and be sure that your subs indicate that they understand and are willing to comply. And lastly, this is very much like a medical record. If it's not in the chart in your medical record, it didn't happen. The same way here, if it's not documented, there's no evidence that you or your subs have conducted what you say you've conducted. Be sure you keep a trail for yourselves. And with that, I hand it over to my co-presenters.
So this is Jenny. I will jump in and say that I think a key thing which was touched on the slide right after we last spoke was this idea of a customer service orientation, and I think that's really key throughout all of this process. You're going to be in your subgrantee's dirty laundry. You're going to be in your own agency's dirty laundry, and you really need to position yourself as working for everybody else, and it's your role to figure out how to solve problems, to figure out how to make it easy for them to understand how match works, how National Service Criminal History Check works, how all these things work. You've got to be that person who's just there, being very responsive to phone calls and emails, and putting those sub needs first so that everybody can get their initiatives underway. There is a lot to do when you're implementing a SIF initiative. The evaluation is intense and beyond the scope of what many subs have experienced before. The documentation requirements are beyond what many have experienced before, so to the extent that you can just position yourself always as their go-to person for any questions, large or small, they can bring any problem or concern to you, and you will help solve it. I think that's the best approach to take.
This is Amber. I'll just add a couple more things. At AARP Foundation, we are big believers in the in-person convening happening really soon after all the agreements were executed. We wanted to bring everyone together because we also wanted to start creating the cohort amongst the subs so that they could have that peer-to-peer relationship that they can sort of tap into in the years throughout the program. And we wanted to be able to have them meet the full AARP Foundation team. Thinking about the convening, a couple of things come to mind. There is a lot of information that can get packed into one of those convenings, and your programmatic and evaluator team members might want all of the agenda. So it's really critical that as a compliance person, you get a portion of the agenda and that it's not the last agenda item of the day. A couple of other things that we did that we think have been a little bit helpful is that my colleague Joanna Wald created a recorded webinar that covers the key financial management and compliance items. In hindsight, for the convening, we should have required that there was a finance or operations person at the convening. That didn't always happen, but a recorded webinar allows those staff or new staff that have come on to be able to access and sort of listen to that critical information. In terms of criminal history checks, in addition to making sure that our subs completed the e-course that's now required, we did an informal check of the subs' background checks by requesting a copy of one file, not for monitoring purposes, but rather so that we could assess and provide any individual TA that might have been needed. We made sure to hold a special webinar that we walked through our online reporting system, Foundation Connect, so that folks could address any questions they might have about how to do the reporting and what needed to be included in the reporting. And then we also just make sure that each of the subs have designated points of contact that they are in touch with on a regular basis. Just one other thing I'll add about going back to criminal history checks is, you know, it's something we've talked to our subs about frequently, right? And they've all completed that recorded webinar. But I think, thinking about the customer service perspective that Jenny mentioned, you really need to know sort of the information around the state repository that your subs are in, and what they need to do, especially if they've never conducted the NSCHC background checks before, sort of how they get set up within their state to be able to pull that off. That's one of the things that, in hindsight, I would have focused on a little bit more. And then finally, I'll just close with saying that, in my opinion, onboarding subs is not a one-time activity, right? You're going to have subs that have new staff over the lifetime of the grant. There'll be moments when they're working on reporting and they'll forget what needs to be included, or there'll be times when they need to be revising their budget and need to be cognizant of what's allowable and allocable and reasonable. So all this just points to an ongoing relationship and providing of information and making sure additional information is readily accessible.
Kimberly.
I don't think at this point I necessarily have more to add. I mean, I think you guys are all the pros at onboarding, and we as POs just try to be your advocate and to provide you with the resources that you have accessible to you. I will also say I think the JBS compliance coaches are also a great resource for, you know, any of the intermediaries. They have templates and ideas and experiences with, you know, training and onboarding in these different types of activities, so definitely use them as a resource as well.
Great, thank you. Rose, I will hand it back to you in your capable hands. Thank you.
Hi, this is Rose. Can you hear me? So
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I thought I was blocked there. We've given you a lot to think about. So now is your chance to ask questions of Brad, Ginny, Amber, and Kimberly. So please write your questions in the chat box. It's been brought to my attention that you may not be able to see all participants. You may just see all panelists. So if you write it into all panelists, I will read those questions off so everybody, so that we can answer them. So please start typing your questions away while you have a captive audience. Do we have any questions from the participants? While we're waiting for that, Brad talked a lot about kind of agenda items. As Jenny, I'm going to ask a question to you. As you guys are getting ready to onboard your second round with your second grant, your second SIF grant, how is your agenda changing from the first time that you did this to this time?
So that's really funny. Our agenda the first time around was really high level. I would say in retrospect it was aspirational, right? To think that we would be able to have these very in-depth conversations and yet quickly get through a ton of material in this one day. I think we had essentially like a one-day onboarding process and just kind of knock this stuff out. And it is not like that. So Amanda Casburn, who's joined our team recently, she's in charge of preparing the onboarding agenda. And I have no doubt that she's really thinking through all of the questions, for example, that will come up. What are the things that are going to delay us making, say, speedy progress through a really ambitious agenda? And how can she structure this so that it really allows a lot of time for conversation? And also, I think for subs to get to know each other. They're going to be working closely, even though they're at different agencies, they're going to be working closely with each other and trying to achieve portfolio-wide goals, working with our external evaluator, all that sort of stuff. So I think the agenda is maybe less ambitious in terms of, we're going to knock all these policies out, and more about getting the subs together as a cohort, getting them to understand some of the processes, and then really doing a lot of the more specific work one-on-one in site visits at subgrantee agencies.
Great, and I really like what Amber said, that onboarding is not a one-time activity. I think I really like that if you create those relationships during the time that you have everyone together, then you've created an environment to allow people to continue to ask those questions and to continue that process. Thank you so much, Jenny. So we have a couple of questions. We have one from Andrew, and he asks, is there, Amber, you talked about a high-level checklist or a checklist to take out on site visits. Do you have such a checklist, or does anyone know of a checklist that exists for the onboarding process?
This is Amber. Unfortunately, I don't have a checklist. That was one of those things, thinking back, that it would be very helpful. If I was going to create one or draft one today, I think where I would start actually is looking at our monitoring tool and sort of using that as a base to sort of get the high category of items that we would want to check in about in advance.
And this is Jenny Callens, and I can tell you that we do have a checklist that's really around policies and procedures. We have not posted it to the Knowledge Network because it's still being reviewed by our controller. But once it is final, we can post that to the Knowledge Network, and that should happen within, I would say, the next week or so. And then what might still be on the Knowledge Network, because I posted this to the Knowledge Network, I think 2 iterations ago of the Knowledge Network, back when, I don't know, those of us who have been around a while remember how many versions of the Knowledge Network we've gone through. But there was kind of a site visit checklist that I used at my regular monthly monitoring visits with subs. Since our portfolio is all based in Greater Detroit, it's easy for us to visit everybody monthly. So that was at one time posted to the Knowledge Network, and I will look to see and make sure that it is still there, or if it's not, I'll repost it. But it has kind of, I'm an anthropologist, So it takes a very loose structure, but make sure that you hit on everything when you're having an unstructured conversation with a sub.
And I would add in that if you're going to design a tool like that, be sure it's focused on organizational development. Don't be too heavy on policy, and don't be too heavy on people. Be somewhere in the sweet spot so that you're leaving behind the strength within the organization and not just with the policies and not just with the people. You want to build that capacity over time as well.
Great. And we have another question. Is there a list of common issues or things to avoid? So Andrew asks if the speakers have any insight on things, items, and issues to avoid during onboarding.
I would say give yourself plenty of time for everything. Everything takes more time than you think, and give yourself the luxury of allowing that time to be there. Give yourself the luxury and your subs the luxury of your presence and your insights and your knowledge. They're coming to this likely as a first award under this program perhaps, and it can be overwhelming to a lot of organizations, especially smaller organizations, to think about how much they have to change in order to comply with this one single award. So think about that as you nurture that relationship and build your relationships with your subs in that way.
And I want to follow up what Brad just said by saying try to avoid surprises. When you're thinking about whether it's an onboarding visit or it's a regular monitoring visit or whatever, as much information as you can share with them in advance about the topics you'll cover will help avoid any sort of deer in the headlights or, oh no, you caught us off guard or anything like that. So this goes back to the customer service orientation and trying to not be punitive. You know, just you're building a relationship, share as much as you can in advance so that they can make sure they have the right people in the room. They can make sure they have all their documents there and there's not this kind of frantic rush to meet demands.
And I would just add that you should try to resist the urge to give them everything all at once. Like Fred hinted, it can be pretty overwhelming, and you know, your team probably thinks that everything you want to cover is of the same importance, but try to be a little discreet in recognizing what needs to be shared now, what can be shared, you know, next week, what can be shared in a month. How can I train them in different ways along the course of the year?
Great insights. Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions? If people could type them into the chat, we will make sure to get those answered for you. So there was a request also just to, when Ginny, and I'll look on the Knowledge Network too as well, and if Ginny's resources there, we'll also just email those out to people in addition to putting them on the Knowledge Network. Any last questions? I'm not seeing any last questions, so any parting advice from any of the presenters?
This is Jenny. I want to remind everybody that we're not actually doing brain surgery or rocket science, and we are all going to make numerous mistakes. And you'll have to go to, you know, your program officer and or your grant officer with questions. Your subs will come to you with questions. And I have yet to encounter a problem with the SIF that we have been unable to solve. So it just takes time and talking to the right people.
And I'll just add that I think it's really important to work with your subs with what they're at and not to be too prescriptive with them. Sort of take where they are and work from there and let them sort of hold their own policies, procedures, and systems, and don't necessarily dictate how that has to look exactly.
A couple of bits from me. I I would recommend avoid comparisons between subgrantee or subrecipient organizations when you're in the field. It's really tempting to say, oh, well, this one is better than that one, and stay away from that. Each one is
Brad, they're all my
yes.
children, and I love them all equally.
That's what I used to say, too, and the grantee that was sitting in front of me didn't like that answer, so always. But give them each their space to grow and strengthen their organizations individually, because they're not all on the same path. The other thing I would suggest is that succession planning is a state of mind and not an activity that you do once in a while. So as your subrecipients are developing all these policies, procedures, processes, everything that they're doing, have them keep in mind that somebody's going to sit down at their desk when they have gone and need to pick up where they left off. So that's the importance of keeping this all written down.
Great, thank you all very much, and I will just do one more plug that your POs are huge resources, your compliance coaches are huge resources, and your peers, the other grantees. I have found, and I have to tap a lot of grantees to talk to things, but the other grantees are always very, very willing to participate and to provide information and their insights and lessons learned. So make sure to reach out to them too. And with that, I will say thank you to both Ginny and Amber, and to Brad, and to Kimberly for helping us with this webinar. If you have any other questions, you're welcome to email them to me, and we will send out the recording of the webinar, the slide deck, and any supplemental resources, anything that Ginny finds or anything that I can find on the Knowledge Network. We'll send all that out to everyone. So thank you very much, and thank you for joining us on the webinar. Have a good afternoon.